Alrighty then, so the rear shock's done and tested. Now it's time for the front forks. Time to install those PD valves. This is a bit more faffing around than doing the rear shock because some of the internals have to be modified. So let's get into it, see what's required.
These are the PD valves that I'm going to fit in the forks. They're sometimes referred to as cartridge fork emulators, but they only affect compression damping. By winding that bolt in, you can increase the compression damping, but once they're installed in the fork, well, you have to take them out again if you want to increase or decrease the damping. Installing these valves doesn't affect the ride height, but I'm just going to check what the ride height is anyway because I've never actually done it to check what the static and active sag is for the front forks. And as you can see, I've got my trained assistant Norm here helping me again. This is pure luxury for me to have those extra hands, and as an added bonus it comes with a brain. So between us we've got 4 hands and 1 brain. Good enough to get the job done. I have spring preload adjusters on my forks. These are aftermarket and I've got them wound right in. And with it wound right in, there's 35mm of static sag. When I release the spring adjusters altogether, I've got 50mm. I could have done this measurement after I'd put the valves in, but I want to have these measurements so that I can play around with the spring preload later when I'm testing the new valves. I found that the instructions that come with the valves were nice, step by step, easy to understand. So let's begin. Loosen off the top triple clamp for the fork. Then loosen the fork cap, just in case it's too tight to undo once the fork is pulled out. Now I need to take the front mudguard off and the front wheel so that I can slide those forks out of the triple clamps. I'm being careful to remove the caliper because there's hardly any gap there and it's really easy to scratch the rim. With all that paraphernalia removed, I can now just loosen the bottom triple clamp and slide the fork right out. Easy peasy. The forks aren't actually rusted at the lower triple clamp area, but they are dirty and marked. So I'm just using some green Scotch-Brite and some silicone spray just to clean them up a bit. Not really required, but I'm a bit pedantic. And by the way, don't get the impression that we don't have management controlling the whole process. Anyway, it's off with the fork cap. And we can get into the goodies. So let's see what this oil looks like. Whoa, it is really dirty. The oil hasn't been changed for 40,000 kilometres. I changed it at 22 and I haven't changed it since. And it's, I'm up to 62. So clearly the moral of the story is change the oil more often. However, it should be noted that I only did a quickie change to 22,000. I didn't disassemble everything and clean everything, which I'll be doing this time. And so that will help with the longevity of the oil. It takes a few pumps to get most of the oil out. I don't want it to go all over the floor when I actually take the screw out of the end. You'll note that I've got some aluminium over the jaws of the vise so that I don't damage the fork leg. Now it's just a matter of taking out that screw out of the bottom, and fortunately, no problem. Undoes relatively easily. This bolt has a copper washer on the end to help seal the oil, and I'll just use the same washer again. That screw screws into the damping rod that keeps it at the bottom of the fork, and here we've got the damping rod. This is the little item that we're going to have to modify. But first, let's give it a bit of a clean up. That fork oil really is slippery stuff. And as we all know, there's nothing like a nice clean rod. The PD valves sit on top of this rod. Now there's a little adapter as well that comes with it, but those adapters don't fit my particular rod, but the valve does fit it, so I don't need those adapters. It's probably time for a bit of theory. These damping rods just have those two small holes in the bottom that the oil gets pushed through when the fork compresses. If you hit a sharp bump, the oil tries to go through that hole very quickly, and it finds it difficult, and so you get a harsh reaction up through the fork. This is referred to as high-speed damping reaction. But if the fork compresses slowly, like over an undulation, then the oil can get through that hole and the damping works correctly. This is what the PD valve tries to overcome. Don't ask me how, I'm just a backyard tinkerer. But I can see it's more complicated than a couple of holes in a pipe. The valve instructions dictate the size of the holes that you have to drill. My rods are 235, and that dictates an 8mm hole has to be drilled in the existing holes, and then 2 more. So we've got my attractive assistant Norm here using the technical equipment because I can't be trusted with it. And so we're going to measure
15.
The fact that the valve is 15 millimeters. We need to know this because we need to cut off that amount from those metal tube spaces. However, because I've already been using full preload on my spring adjusters, I'm going to only cut 10mm off rather than 15 to give me a little bit more range on the spring adjustment. I'm careful to grind off all those sharp edges from cutting the end off that tube, and then remove any swarf or excess from the inside as well with this useful little tool. It's probably a worthwhile exercise to make sure that both of those tubes are the same as well. Yep, spot on. The theory behind drilling out the existing holes at the end of the damping rod and then putting 2 more holes in that rod is to make sure that the oil has free flow up into the rod and is not restricted by those holes, because we want the oil to go right up through the rod and then into the PD valve and let it do the job rather than that couple of tiny holes at the bottom. So there we go, 4 holes drilled. But again, we need to make sure we clean all the swarf out of this. We don't want any swarf flowing around in those forks once they're put together. So the first step is to cut all those rough edges off. Then squirt some cleaner down inside. And then use a rag on a rod to do the final clean out, to get all the crap and all the little bits and pieces out. With all the technical work done, it's time to reassemble. So, first of all, the damping rod goes back down in, and the bolt goes and screws into the damping rod and holds it into place. And then back in the vise again to just tweak that bolt up so it's nice and tight. I'm putting the standard 10 weight fork oil back in. It needs just a bit more than a litre, but fortunately I have some in one bottle and then a full litre in another. And I'm not putting it all in at once. I'm putting about half of it in, and then I'm going to pump the fork up and down to just get rid of any air that might be down in the system down in there. The manual calls for 514 millimetres of oil in each leg. It also says that another way to do it is to measure 104 millimetres from the top of the fork down to the oil. And this is a much more accurate way of doing it, and that's what I'm going to do in this instance. I'm going to use the measurement. I've got a little stick that's 104 millimetres long, and I just keep popping that in until I get the oil at the end of the stick. It takes a surprisingly little oil to make a big difference in the height, so I found that I only needed to take a very small amount at a time into the fork and then remeasure until I got it where it was just got oil on the end of that stick. Perfect. I'm just using a mechanical grabber to hang onto the PD valve so that I can push it down through the oil and on top of the damping rod. Now I can put the spring back in, and then the washer on top of the spring. And then the spacer tube. I find putting the fork cap on the most worrying. The thread is very fine and it's only aluminium, and it'd be very easy to get that cross-threaded. But I get them in no problem. And just tweak it up till it's firm. And now I can just slide the forks back into the triple clamps, and I'm almost home and hosed. Robert will very soon be my mother's brother. So I insert the fork until the cap is just above the triple clamp, and then I can tweak up the bottom triple clamp. Once I've got everything in, I'll tighten it all up. I'm not going to bore you with the long, laborious process of putting all the bits back together. We'll just speed this up, just to show that it is possible. But really, it's just the reverse of what you saw at the beginning. So there's nothing really technical about this part. And I'm tempted to add Benny Hill music to it, but I resist the temptation. In sped up mode, I almost look competent. I had to squeeze the pistons back to get the caliper back onto the disc. And it's just as well I've got Norm here, because I'd forgotten to pump the front brake to put the calipers back into place. That would have given me a bit of a shock. I've got the spring preload right off, and it feels just a bit soft to me, so I'm going to put a bit of preload back on the spring, and then I'll test and play with that later. But now it's time to test. But that's for part 4.